So I'll start again. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Mohill Historical Society, you're all very welcome here to our event to mark the 100 years nearly to the time of the passing of Dr Muldoon. I just want to run through the lineup for the evening. As some of you may have seen the flyer around the town and in the paper, there's a lot of things we need to get through tonight. So first up, tonight's event is being recorded, so anybody who wishes to view it after, and we can share it with friends and family abroad. We will be walking down through the main street, and I would just like to ask everyone to follow me down the town. Don't pass out me, and watch out for your own safety, and listen to the instructions from the guards and the stewards on the way down. We've also produced a lovely little booklet on the events, and we'll be giving these out later in Casey's pub, and as the saying goes, there's one for everybody in the audience. So we are asking people to contribute to this story as well, and all the details are in the back of this booklet, because we've discovered while we were researching this and talking to locals, loads of other little stories came out that we were unaware of, and so we want to capture these in the Historical Society. And so you can submit these by the booklet, or you can do it on the night in Casey's. We have paper and pen.
I'll take the key.
About 110 years ago, in this area right across Ireland, there was only one game in town. That game was Home Rule. And Home Rule essentially was it involved government in Dublin while remaining in the British Commonwealth. And most Irish nationalists were buying into Home Rule. And the Home Rule party was very, very strong right across Ireland and here in Mohill and right across Leitrim. But things changed quite a bit. World War I started in 1914, and a war that was supposed to be over by Christmas wasn't over for 4 years. But that war divided the Irish nationalists, led by John Redmond. Many wanted to actually go along with, and again, everybody wanted Home Rule. Redmond took the majority of Irish nationalism to support World War I with the hope that they would get Home Rule. The war continued, casualties rose, and a lot of people from this area died in that war, fighting for England, but also fighting for Home Rule as far as they were concerned. A small group of nationalists, led by the likes of Padraig and Leitrim's own Sean McGarty, led a revolution or revolt, as we know, in 1916 in Dublin. Those 7 leaders, and along with 9 more from that wider cohort of leaders, were executed by British authorities. And what followed, we had mass arrests and jailings in England of Irish nationalists. And especially the executions of Padraig, Sean McGarty and their comrades, that turned Irish nationalists against Home Rule and against Britain. And what we find between 1916 and 1918 a massive transformation and a transfer of political allegiance from what once was what we would call Home Rule as I say, a devolved government to outright independent republicanism, and that was it as far as Irish Republicans were concerned. Again, Home Rule was forgotten about very, very quickly, and the goal was a 32-county republic. Sinn Féin swept the boards at the 1918 election, and essentially the Irish Parliamentary Party that was previously led by John Redmond dissolved into oblivion in many ways. What followed then, between 1919 and 1921, we had the War of Independence. And in this area, and in South Leitrim generally, it was the most active part of Leitrim. We find, a number of incidents, but while we, as a county, we would be termed one of the quiet counties, we find really that there was a massive campaign of boycott and intimidation by Republicans against the British Crown. And we find the likes of Michael Collins encouraging, Republicans here in Leitrim to do what they would continue to do, because what they were doing was proving very, very successful against Crown forces. We find a number of incidents in South Leitrim. One of them was out 5 miles from here in Gorva, at Selton Hill, where the IRA suffered the second biggest number of collective casualties in that War of Independence, when 6 men were killed by Crown forces at Selton. We find then in 1921, in July, we find the truce. And then between July 21 and December 21, that truce period, we find leaders of Irish nationalism, Irish republicanism, trying to negotiate a long-term settlement with Britain. Now, that settlement was negotiated and a treaty was signed in December 1921. That treaty bitterly divided Irish nationalism. It bitterly divided the likes of the De Valera faction and the Michael Collins faction. Michael Collins, as far as he was concerned, he felt that that's all they could get, and it was a lot more than home rule. A lot of people were saying, was there much difference between what Collins got and what was on offer a couple of years previously? It was a hell of a lot more. In fact, what it was essentially was, a certain amount of independence. The king still, Dáil Éireann and anybody in Dáil Éireann at the time had to swear allegiance, but it was to the British king. But it was a lot more than Home Rule was. There's been a lot of discussion and controversy about that. But essentially that treaty was ratified by a very narrow majority. And what we find in 1922, it was ratified in January 1922, but what we find then is you find Crown forces evacuating Ireland, essentially. And in this area, it was a case of, what side are you on? Are you pro-treaty or anti-treaty? Now, this area in Leitrim generally went pro-treaty, very much on the side of Michael Collins. And one of the reasons maybe that this area, like a lot of other areas, went pro-treaty was, or anti-treaty for that matter in other areas, was the influence of, major leaders. And the major leader in this area of republicanism at the time was Sean McCown, the Blacksmith of Ballinalee. He had a massive influence around this area. So what we find is, we find British forces evacuating and the barracks around South Leitrim being occupied essentially by pro-treaty IRA. That's what we find. Things started again, there was a number of attempts at reconciliation between both sides, but all came to naught. But what we find is, we find in June 1922, we find an election, and that election endorsed the treaty. The vast majority of people, of ordinary people at the time around Ireland, were pro-treaty. Nevertheless, we still had, major divisions among what we would call political activists, between anti-treaty and pro-treaty. And as such, civil war broke out in June 1922, 28th of June 1922. And for that summer, we find massive advances by the forces of the new Free State against the anti-treaty IRA. In this area, we find the likes of Mohill here and Carrick and all that. There were pro-treaty. There wasn't much fighting around this area at all. The nearest major piece of conflict was the battle for Boyle. And what we find Boyle and Sligo, we find, again, a lot of fighting in those areas. Like the rest of Ireland, we find then that at the end of the summer, Free State forces control the major towns of Ireland, including the major towns in this area. And we find then that Republicans, the anti-treaty IRA, went and they took to the hills to fight guerrilla warfare against the Free State forces. So that's essentially what was happening. Now, what we find is, in this area, we find that, when we look at Sligo, Leitrim, or Slevin, we find major resistance, major anti-treaty resistance in this area. Down in North Leitrim and North Sligo, there was a huge force of anti-treaty IRA men led by Dean Pilkington. And closer to here, to Mohill, we find over in Arigna, we find, again, an equally strong unit of anti-treaty IRA, led by Edward and Ned Finn. So what we find is, in that period, we find, again, a lot of attacks on towns. We find right across, what we would call North Leitrim, Sligo, Slevin, and especially the area around Bandamore and Drumshanbo. Again, not much happening here, a bit of sniper fire and stuff like that against National Army or Free State forces. And again, they were based right across the road in what many of us would know as Master Kelly's house, just right across the road here from the church. That's where the garrison was at the time. And we find reports of shooting from the hills here, the hills just out here, against the National Army and Free State forces here in Mohill. So that's essentially what was happening up until early January 1923. Things started to happen quite a bit in early January 1923. We find a massive offensive of Free State forces against the Arigna column. Now, the Arigna column, in many respects, they were very, very strong, very audacious, and they developed huge notoriety in many ways. And one of the things they did, at one stage, they went in on the 1st of February. To give you an example of what they did, they arrived into Bandamore, they attacked the Army garrison and the Civic Guard, the new police force barracks. And what they did was, they went along and captured the 35-man garrison, and they put them on a train and took them to Drumshanbo as prisoners. And again, that created outrage. It was actually brought up in the House of Commons, so that was the type of stuff that was happening. A week later, they went into Ballyconnell, not too far from Bandamore, we know it, just across the border from Cavan. And there they were involved again in an attack, as it was a revenge attack on one of their comrades, Michael Cole, who was killed a month previously. And in that attack, there was 2 civilians killed and the town was sacked and burned. It was a revenge attack. That's what the raiders claimed. But in shooting 2 civilians and, sacking the town or burning the town, it created a massive offensive. So what we find, when we get to February 1923, we find a major offensive here, and the anti-treaty IRA were on the back foot. So what we find here, we find occasional shooting, burnings, sniping, that's the type of stuff we get. So that's where we find ourselves. But 1 or 2 people stand out, I suppose, when we go along and look at what we're commemorating here tonight, remembering the events of 100 years ago. We find that one of the major Republican leaders, he was president of Sinn Féin at the time, was a man called Father Paddy Ryan. Father Ryan was curate in Abbas. He was a close friend of General Sean McCombs. They got to know each other at the 1917 election, a famous election in Longford that returned Joe McGuinness as one of the first Sinn Féin MPs, members of Parliament, abstentionist members of Parliament. So Ryan and McComb were very, very close friends. Another man that we'll talk about tonight is Paddy Muldoon, Dr Paddy Muldoon. Paddy Muldoon was, again, a very popular GP here in Mohill. He came to Mohill in 1918, and we find really, he also was a medical officer for the Free State Army. But despite holding that post, he also went along and treated, anti-treaty IRA men as well. So there was no bother as far as he was concerned, in treating both sides, from the point of view of being a doctor. Now, Paddy was married a number of years. His wife, Rita, was actively involved in Mohill Nursing Association here. And she came to know this, again, a young 19-year-old woman, Mary Kate Gillobie, from Abbas. She was from Shambo North in Abbas. Mary Kate was 19 years of age. She was pregnant, and suspicion grew that she was a housekeeper, recently appointed housekeeper for Father Ryan in Abbas. So controversy grew about, and rumours spread about the father of her child. Ritas Muldoon was very, again, involved in the case. At that time as well, Father Ryan, again, while initially he was a man who took the pro-treaty side, in fact he was delegated to go and attend, again, and bring the vote, the Leitrim vote to Dublin. What we find is that for the first 6 or 8 months of 1922, he was firmly pro-treaty, and as I say, he was very, very close to General Sean McCombs. Then we find a change of tack in many ways with him. People would say he was, again, originally born in England, family home was in outside KG, just beside Arena, and his brother was very actively involved in that Arena column that I spoke about earlier. So what we find that there was a change. We find is that he changed tack in many ways. He then went along and basically he became very active on the anti-treaty side. We find again his behaviour for those couple of months in January and February and March. Again, he became erratic. He went to Dublin. Mary Kate Gillobie was sent to Dublin in late 1922. She had her baby in late January 22. 2 weeks later, Father Ryan came to Dublin. Basically what happened was then, on the 13th of February, himself and Mary Kate Gillobie were noticed and found and arrested in an attempt to abandon a baby girl that was born to Mary Kate in Hollis Street Hospital towards the end of January. So what we find is, we find an arrest, we find Father Ryan's coming back to Mohill. Himself and Mary Kate were let out on bail, and for 2 or 3 weeks his behaviour was very erratic. He knew Ritas Muldoon, Paddy Muldoon's wife, he would have accused her of meddling in his affairs. He was seen brandishing a revolver in many cases as well. And what we find an erratic priest in many ways issuing threats on Ritas Muldoon and on Paddy Muldoon, and talking to Paddy Muldoon about his wife. And that's where we come to when we go along. And the 18th of March, Passion Sunday, on a mild, moonless night, Paddy Muldoon and his friend Edward Gleelan was secretary of the local board of guardians. The two of them came up to town here and came up to play cards, which was a usual routine, on Monday night, on Sunday night, I should say, the 18th of March, with Canon Michael Masterson. And what we do is, this is where it ends, and this is where the rest of tonight begins. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, and I just want to say a very public thank you to Father Nigel. We put you under pressure there, so deeply appreciated. So if everybody now makes their way downtown and follows Kim's very good orders about just mind yourselves on the way down, and we'll meet you down at the screen. Thanks.
Lovely. So listen everybody, where we left off at the church, Padraig had just said that Dr Muldoon was playing cards with his friend Edward Geelan and Canon Masterson. And over the last couple of minutes we've just retraced his last steps, his journey down through Main Street, heading for his house, Coolabon House, about 100 metres over here out the Clune Road. So over the last few weeks, a lot of local talent. I stress the word talent. A lot of people were out in all sorts of weather shooting a movie, and this is very different from, you know, we've got textbooks now on this topic. We've heard talks, but just to actually see it on the screen is something a bit different, and it probably will help you bring home the human side, the poignancy of this story. It's a short film, but an awful lot of work went into it, and we're very lucky to have so many people dedicated to keeping this story alive. We're also delighted to have members of the Muldoon family here. Just after this film, please stay where you are, but Malcolm, who's the grandson of Dr. Paddy Muldoon, will unveil the plaque which is across the road at Baxter's. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy the 10-minute film. Thank you.
No. Good night, Edward.
Good night, Paddy. Good night. Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Don't shoot! This Dr Muldoon! Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
Edward, I'm shot.
Jesus Christ! Jesus! Paddy! Turn, oh, Jesus! Oh, no. Quick. He was shot. Okay. Go and get a priest and a doctor, quick! What happened? He was shot.
This is Muldoon, and he must hold it 1 second.
Father?
Mrs. Muldoon, I'm very sorry. I'm bringing you bad news about your husband. He's got shot over the road. He's gone, and I'm very sorry.
thank you very much for your attention. Malcolm is just making his way over. Malcolm is the grandson of Dr. Paddy Muldoon. His mother was Alban, the little girl you saw in the film. And he's just making his way over to the other side of the street there. If you all want to turn around.
So, I just would like to welcome Malcolm Donnelly, who is a grandson of Olin, who was the little girl you saw in the video tonight. So Malcolm and his family have joined us for the night with his own children and his wife, and he's going to unveil the plaque that we have dedicated to Dr. Paddy Muldoon. So.
We just had no sense that this number of people would turn up, so if you could just take standing room or sitting room or whatever it is you can find, and we will begin. Right, let me start again, and we are really fortunate and honoured to have the co-authors, both of them. If anybody, I can't believe there's anybody here who hasn't read that, but this excellent story of the murder of Dr. Muldoon. So Ken lives in Dublin, but actually is related to the Muldoons. I worked it out last night. Your first cousin twice removed of Dr. Muldoon, and and has, although worked in the financial services sector, had a long interest in history. And one of the things I've come to know about Ken, not least through the book, is there's a fantastic humanity blended with absolute rigorous research that just comes through in everything you do. So, welcome to Mohill again. And we're also joined by Tim Desmond, who many of you heard it. In fact, I think it was on the old Mohill Facebook. They rebroadcast that excellent documentary from the documentary of One RT, and it's Tim Desmond that we have to thank for that. So I don't know which came first. I think the documentary and the research and the documentary. But Tim still works in RT on documentary on One. And so this evening we're going to try, we're in Casey, so let's try and keep it kind of relatively informal. What I think we want to also, Kim mentioned it at the church, we truly want to hear some of the stories that people here have heard about the events of that night. So, feel free to put up your hand, and ask a question. But I'm going to start with the really obvious one, because the film ends there. We heard the great introduction from Port McGarty, and the film ends with no one was ever charged with his murder. So can you tell us what happened? So Dr. Muldoon is back in Coolabon House. He was there, the inquest was carried out the next day, and the funeral was on the 21st. But what happened after that, Ken?
I suppose the best way of putting it is that the Civic Guard, they hadn't established in Mohill at the time. So the Civic Guard who took up the investigation, they were based in Carrick-on-Shannon and based in Slevin. So they ran with the investigation in the early days, but by April, General McKeown had become involved, and he had written up to Richard Mulcahy, who was the Defence Department Minister, and he had more or less told him that to date he discovered that the Father Ryans had driven the unit into the town, and that the unit were led by a local guy called Keegan. So they had established that by April, and Mulcahy also asked, he as I say, he in turn was in contact with O'Higgins, the Minister of Home Affairs, which was to become Justice, and he asked if he passed on McKeown's request that they send down the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, to take over the investigation from the Civic Guard, and then that's when things started going wrong. they came down and they investigated, and so on the morning of May the 9th, when Mary Kay Gallogly was due to go back up to Dublin to face the child abandonment case alongside Father Ryan's, she was actually basically kidnapped or arrested at the home of another curate, the curate in Clune, and she was taken off to the ladies' detention camp in Athlone, which was Keown's headquarters.
Can I? Sorry, I'm just going. So what? So if you can just summarise, like, what was this story? Why was nobody arrested? And just Tim, do you want?
Well, I suppose I was just talking to John Reynolds there earlier, and he's mentioned this to me a few times. They were different times, and we all know that 100 years ago was a very different time in Ireland. If what happened outside on the street here 100 years ago tonight happened tonight, you can only imagine what it would be like tomorrow. You'd have forensics, you'd have every divisional group, you'd have helicopters flying overhead, you'd have a huge, very precise investigation going on. And I suppose the point Ken is making is that at the time, law enforcement, if you like, in this country was very fragmented. We were in a big period of transition from one regime, if you like, to another. And as a result, this wasn't the only crime that was committed that couldn't be followed through on. So in some ways, it's not particularly unique. I mean, it's extremely tragic, and I think the film that we saw tonight captured that very poignantly. But in terms of the investigation, it was almost from the start an impossible task to successfully investigate something like that at that time, given the different forces and powers that were at large in the country, and particularly in this part of the country, because a lot of the country had sort of settled down, but of course this was an area that hadn't. So I think that's important for people to remember, that, you know, they were very, very different times. But to another extent, what we tried to document in the book was how all the different forces in the country at the time reacted to what happened, and they sort of forgot, if you like, that it was a very human tragedy, and the families and relations of people involved are in the room tonight, and the consequences of what happened is still playing out in people's lives, you know. But I'm kind of getting beyond myself there. But in terms of the investigation, I think Ken, it was inevitable that it was going to be inconclusive.
Well, hold on, how do we go from there?
The mic up.
So then we move into the three court cases in Dublin, which Father Ryan's faced for the abandonment of the child. He was arrested. He was arrested, I think it was shortly after, the day after Rita Muldoon actually spoke to General McKeown, met him over in Longford. He was arrested the next day, and he spent the rest of the year actually in prison, while he was being tried 3 times for the child abandonment charge. The jury on each occasion could not reach a conclusion, but at the same time the state didn't move against him on the murder involvement. Yeah.
So the next obvious question is, do we know what happened to Mary Kay Gallogly?
Well, as I say,
we can't hear you down the back,
sorry. Mary Kay Gallogly, as I mentioned, was basically kidnapped on the morning that she should have been getting ready to travel up to Dublin for the first abandonment case. And at that case, the prosecutor mentioned that they weren't going to proceed with the case against her. Didn't say why. But she had been sent over, as I mentioned, to the ladies' detention camp in Athlone. And we were very fortunate because there were one or two coming among ladies in the prison with her, in the cell with her, and one of them wrote a letter home and described this girl that had been brought in and put in with them, and she was very, very vulnerable and very traumatized, which gave us an opportunity just to see how vulnerable this young lady who was being abused by the system, gave us an insight into her situation. The third child abandonment case was held in August, and at that stage the prosecutor mentioned that Mary Kay Gallogly was in an asylum. So she'd gone from the detention centre into a mental asylum. So her mental situation was obviously, getting worse.
So, Tim, going back to you, what do you think are the really important aspects of this story as we because there's so many threads to it?
That's a kind of a big question, Fiona. Yes. But for me, when we started on this project, myself and Ken on the book, there were a lot of stories, if you like, and a lot of them didn't have much to back them up. And I'm sure people here would have heard stories over the years or didn't hear stories, and there wasn't much to back them up apart from what people had said to other people. And what Ken, as Fiona said, is extremely good at doing is finding the evidence. And in a case of murder, you can be convicted on circumstantial evidence. And there's an awful lot of circumstantial evidence in the book to suggest that on the big charge, the charge of ordering the murder of another human being, that case would probably be successfully tried on the circumstantial evidence, especially if Ken was on the prosecuting team. And when you do that, so that's important to remember. And again, going back to the fact that it was 100 years ago, there was nobody with the strength to do that, particularly considering the location of the murder. The child abandonment case in Dublin was quite different because there was no way that could be avoided because of the way it played out. The women from Dominic Street who saw what was going on and reported it to the guards, who took statements, and that was all gathered together by the prosecution. And in some ways in Dublin, the fact that Edward Ryan's was a priest didn't matter. The facts were the facts and the case was tried. The fact that the case wasn't proven on 3 occasions because of the juries probably speaks to the way people felt at the time about somebody like a priest. But what I would like to say about the important, what's always struck me when I was involved in this story, and still am, are the women in the story.
I was going to ask you about that.
And the 2 women particularly who stand out for me are Ritas Muldoon and Mary Kay Gallogly. And when we started on the story, we weren't even sure of the name of the young woman. And I don't know, is it okay to say? There was a story, again a story that somebody had heard and told us, about Mary Kay Gallogly, that she had gone to America and married an Italian man and lived in Lowell, Massachusetts. And that was a story that was told to a very reliable person who reported that story to us. But after the documentary and the book, some woman was in Australia and she put into Google her grandmother's name, was as simple as that. She wanted to know about her grandmother because her grandmother hadn't talked, and her father didn't know much about the grandmother's life or whatever it was. So she put in the name Mary Kate Gallogly. And the first thing that came up was the book, and the second thing that came up was the documentary. And she was completely shocked because she heard the story about her grandmother. And what we now know happened is that Mary Kate Gallogly
came back to Ireland.
Yeah.
Mary Kate apparently did go to America, but came back to Ireland in 1923 and married Peter Maguire, who was maybe about 15 years older than her. They went on to have 4 children, 4 boys, which I suppose is sad in a way that she didn't have another girl, because the little baby Rose Brown that was born in Hollis Street was dead within 2 months. They lived up beyond Fiona, Drumani something I think it was called, and by 1967 Mary Kate Gallogly was a widow, and she was living with her youngest son of 4. 2 of the older sons had gone out to Australia, so Mary Kate and the son, they sold up the house and probably the farm, and they went out to Australia to join the other 2 brothers, and she lived out the rest of her life there. And it was her granddaughter who got in touch with us. The granddaughter was born, I think, a few months after Mary Kate died, but she was aware that Mary Kate actually did suffer from depression, and it's understandable when you think of the trauma what she was put through at a very young age.
And to finish that, because I agree with you, Tim. I mean, I think I said it to you, Ken, when I read that book first. I said you should have called it Ritas Story, because I think it's Rita shines through. So Rita tried very hard to get justice. So, do you want to just talk a little bit about her story?
You'd always be struck by the bravery of Rita. If you think about it, the most recent kind of conflict most of us my age would be aware of would have been the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which spilled over down here. But here you had, just in the aftermath of a civil war, where there was a lot of open wounds, and one part of the population didn't agree with the other part of our population, and she immediately stood up for her dead husband's reputation when the IRA investigation came out in May 1924 and tried to make out that his killing was all a mistake, that he was thought to have been a National Army soldier in civilian clothes in the night, that he was wearing a trench coat. And Rita was very quick to point out that he wasn't wearing a trench coat, he was just wearing a kind of jacket and trousers. It was a very warm March 18th, 1923, as he came down that hill. So yeah, she was left with looking for justice for herself and her children and her dead husband, but the system colluded against her, the state, the church and the IRA, all in their own ways.
So let me, is there anybody here who'd like to ask a question, or Tim? No? That's unusual. Usually we always get hands in the air. Yeah.
The doctor's niece and nephew, Thomas William and Rita. What about Thomas William? Thomas William done an awful lot of work to try and find out exactly what happened. Do you know anything about him at all? Just repeat the question.
The question is about the involvement of Thomas William Muldoon in the story. And Thomas William Muldoon was, as the questioner pointed out, a nephew of Dr Muldoon. I actually met Thomas William Muldoon when one of the first times I ever came down to Leitrim was a very young teenager, and that's not the day or yesterday, and I haven't forgotten him, just ever met him once. But he became obsessed by the injustice of the whole thing, that his uncle had been shot down, and it was covered up by the church, by the state, by the IRA. So he spent his life going around following leads. He confronted Father Ryan's in the church in Mohill in Lancaster. He left leaflets in the church. He went to and he left leaflets in every house on the street where Father Ryan's lived. He confronted each individual who was a member of the unit that took part in his uncle's killing. He followed one of them into a nursing home in Dublin and to question him a second time. You know, he did everything he could.
Because I remember, we remember Thomas William here in Mohill as youngsters. That's why
He was the type of character you wouldn't easily forget.
Yeah, and Rita, yeah.
Can I just make a point about Thomas William that was really important when I was doing the first bit of work on it. And it just, for everybody here, the value of telling your story to someone so that it can be recorded and kept. Because when I got access to the oral history recording, which Thomas William made, I think in 1992, to a Ballinamore Library or a Ballinamore Oral History,
Local studies,
local
oral history.
An oral history project. When I heard that, when I heard his voice, I'd never met the man. It really energized me to tell the story. I really believed what he was saying, the passion that he had, and it was one very important voice that I heard and that we put in the documentary. And it just shows that, you know, I have family who don't talk about things that come from that time. And it's very, very hard to get them to tell you. It really is. But what you should always try, and if you have something, tell somebody, because you never know when it's important in a story. And I think Thomas William was the real hero on the BSA motorbike driving around, and, you know, you could say that he was obsessed and that he went too far with some of the things he did or whatever, but the fact that he wanted his story told and he wanted it heard and not forgotten is, you know, that worked out for him, because we're here tonight and people in Mohill are remembering what happened, and a lot of that is largely due to Thomas William and to the person who put a microphone in front of him and said, "Tell me your story."
Any other questions or stories? We've heard a few stories over the last few weeks here, as people say, yeah, you know, my mother used to always talk about that, or there was one woman who was able to tell us that either she or her mother or grandmother actually saw the shooters running down Cool Station Road and saw them and said, "Daddy, you know, them men have guns," and the gunman said, "You saw nothing." So, you know, and it's those bits of detail that really bring a story, bring history to life. So anybody, any question or story?
Should I? If you wish. Can I just introduce?
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier that following the publication of the book, I always thought, you know, what more will happen? Will some elements of the book be denied? Will we hear from people that we didn't hear from? I mean, we were lucky we heard from Mary Kay Globely's granddaughter. But just 2 weeks ago, through Mercer's, our publishers, I had contact from Tom Henry, who's here in front of me, and I've had a most amazing exchange of emails with Tom. Tom's great grandaunt married Vincent Ryan's, which was Vincent was brother of Father Ryan's, and he was able to fill me in on information that I wasn't aware of, and finally provided me with a photograph of Father Edward Ryan's. I've been looking for one for years, and Tom and his partner Melissa, Mel, isn't it? Melanie or Mel, have gone to the trouble of turning up here tonight, just 2 weeks later.
I hope it's a rather nerve-wracking thing to do in some ways. And this is a story that I've only heard about 4 weeks ago. When Tim talks about things that aren't talked about, this is a story that's been under my family's nose for 100 years, and we've not known a thing about it. We knew that our Uncle Vincent and Edward Ryans were in the IRA, and we always knew that. What we didn't know was anything about Edward Ryans whatsoever. We assumed that he'd come to England because he'd been excommunicated for his IRA activities. That's what we thought. We had no idea that any of this had taken place. I only found it out by accident, really, by doing some research into Vincent Ryans. And I contacted someone in Kilmainham jail who basically said, did he have a brother who was a priest? And I said, yes, he did, oddly enough. And she sent me a link to the story in the Irish Independent and the link to the RTE documentary. And to say I was shocked is a complete understatement. As a family, we're incredibly shocked by it. It's absolutely horrifying. And we, like I say, we'd no idea about it. It certainly affected a couple of old aunties in my family who didn't really ever expect to hear something like this. But what I can say about Edward Ryans, for what it's worth, is that he died in 1964. He died as an alcoholic. He died in what was then a lunatic asylum in Lancaster, in Lancashire. Guilt-ridden, whatever, who knows? But he obviously had this thing stuck with him for years. He did say mass again. He moved to Blackpool in Lancashire, and he was allowed to say mass in Sacred Heart Church in Blackpool, but only on a side altar and only in the presence of nobody in the congregation. So it was quite a weird end for him, really. I never knew him. He died before I was born, but I did know Vincent. I was about 8 or 9 when he died, so I did know my Uncle Vincent. And he was a nice guy, but there was an absolute code of silence over this, and to say it's been a shock is an understatement, really. So that's my story, and you know, from one family to another, I think we send our very deep apologies to the Muldoon family for what this man put them through, and as we know, things ripple down the generations and they tend to affect things. So, yes. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Tom, thanks very much for sharing that with us. As I mentioned, Tom fulfilled one kind of remaining target I had, which was to obtain a photograph of Edward Ryans, which is used on the flyer. But one other photograph Tom told me about, which I find nearly more interesting at this stage, is Tom mentioned to me that his great-grandaunt Kathleen, who married Vincent, she came from an Irish family as well. But they somewhere in the family's attic, there's a picture of Kathleen and her 2 sisters and Michael Collins. And
I don't know how or why, but...
well, because they knew him. So, you know, Kathleen must have come from very, you know, high Republican stock, you know, I mean, to have contacts like that. And I think it'd be great to see that photograph.
We're still looking.
Thank you.
And you are welcome, and Mel, to Mohill.
Thank you very
so
much.
it's very good of you to come. I'm going to, because we've nearly gone around on all the players, if Padraig doesn't mind, I might ask you just to say what happened to the alleged shooters, or the actual ones, or what happened afterwards here in terms of, because there was a bit of shooting going on and there was a bit of re-roll.
Here we are. No, you're okay.
Yeah, very tricky one. You know, there's no barristers or solicitors in the house, there now.
M&P is over there.
Turn the other way then.
Back to the wall.
What happened, I suppose, it's alleged, in many ways, when you look at the shooters, they didn't stop here. They were involved, or allegedly involved, in a number of other killings. The following day, just across the border in Ballinamok, there was a Free State soldier was killed. And it was alleged, I say alleged, that there was certainly a connection with the shooters here, that were involved in the killing here.
Did they just say that Free State soldier was at Fitzgerald and it was
Fitzgerald.
from Mohill?
From Mohill, there. So there's another Mohill connection in many ways. And then after that we find there was a lot of, I suppose, burnings. Eugene Kilkenny's house was killed. Torched, I should say. Again, allegedly by the same crew. And we find as well that there was there was a couple of attempted killings around the area between here and Bornacoola, and up around Thunahavas as well. So there was 2 actual killings. One was a Reynolds man, again allegedly by the same crew, and we find there was another man who was a former Free State officer, Kevil, was killed. And it's actually ironic because Frank Aiken, who features in the book, Ken Tim's book, Frank Aiken, the order to dump arms by the anti-treaty side was on the 24th of May. Their arms were dumped. Obviously the lads didn't hear the order, because Kevil was killed on the 25th. He died. So he was probably the last, if you want to take a couple of hours or two, one of the last people killed in the Irish Civil War, just out here, out the road here, and that was it. So we find that crew were circulating. They were alive and dangerous, and that was it. So it was occasional, because as I said earlier, the 2 major I suppose forces of resistance against the national government, or the Free State government, were based in Arigna, and were based in down in North Leitrim and North Sligo. So up here at that particular time, especially, like it was the last months of the Civil War, the anti-treaty side, they were on the back foot essentially. This area was saturated, and that was it. So.
Very good. The first time I heard of John Charlie Keegan, just to give you an idea of how alive the thing was, in the early 60s, carnivals were common right across the country, carnival dance, and everyone that was young and old went to the carnivals. That time you had guys like Big Tom and Larry Cunningham and all that singing at the carnival. But young and old went to them, and we happened to have a carnival at Cornageha out in Cortletra, right close to where John Charlie Keegan came from. And at that time there was a lot of talk, not that much talk about John Charlie Keegan, but that he was coming home to Ireland. He had been in America for quite a number of years, and that he was coming back to Ireland, and that he was going to turn up at the carnival fully armed. There was an old spleen to be settled. So we were told, or believed, and the rumour was that Keegan was going to be at the carnival and there was going to be men there to shoot him. So we thought this was the most exciting thing could happen. like the gunfight at the OK Corral. But unfortunately, Keegan did turn up. He did turn up at the carnival that night, but there was no one there to shoot him, not that we knew of anyway. So it petered out. But I remember that's the first time I saw John Charlie, and for want of a better word, he was the most miserable looking character you could imagine. He was about my height, not very big man, and he had sallow skin because he'd been in someplace down in Las Vegas or California or someplace there for a number of years, and his skin was like a prune. He was dark and he had long blonde hair, which at the time not too many had long hair, and he wore some kind of a frock coat, something like Jesse James or White Herb or some of them as well. So he stood out in the crowd, but he liked the image, and he lived for a while there down with his sister, Mrs. Buckland, and really nice, decent woman. And then I think he went to England, but he came back again, and he spent quite a bit of time not too far from where I lived. So that's how I got to know him, and he used to cut turf or help at the cutting of the turf in the bog. So quiet man, he used to talk and walk out the bog paths with us, and of course I never brought up the subject. Well, I wouldn't have known about it then anyway very much. But I was at his funeral. He died in 1977, and he was 77, so he was buried not in his own plot, but in his sister's plot, Mrs. Faulkner. And again, the stories were always going around, and we saw him as a local kind of a folk hero more than a real person until I got much older and I realised. But as I said at the time, the night of the lad's spook here, he was on the run when he was 17, you know, so as a 17-year-old with a sort of a local hero, it's you know, it's hard to fathom what was in his mind, but he took on the role of a hero and as a gunman, and he relished it, and he indeed, in fact, at some cases he took credit for shootings that he didn't do, but he did enough of them just the same, just to justify his image. But that's all I say about John Charlie. He came home, and Thomas William got to know his whereabouts, and he actually went back to England as an old man and died in a hospital in Leeds, because Thomas William wasn't giving up on him. He certainly, for want of a better word, drove him out of the country as an old man, and he died in a nursing home in Leeds, but he was brought home and buried in Gortletter graveyard. So Lord have mercy on them all, that's all I can say. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I'm going to ask just Tim to wrap it up with a few words, if that's okay, Tim.
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's the 18th of March 2023. We're actually coming to the end of the decade of commemoration, which is something that I don't know if many people were even aware of it, but we've had it through, you know, the lockout, the 1916, the War of Independence. And now we've come to a point, you know, like Pat said, this is the time 100 years ago that the Civil War came to an end. And I just want to make a point about stories. And some people might say, sure, that's in the past, let it go. There's no point in telling that story. But one of the functions of a story, and of stories that we tell and stories that we hear, is to help us to move on. I know in the case of Tom there, the shock of finding out something about somebody who was connected to his family, but it's only by hearing it that you can move on from it. Then it's over, then it's out there. And I would just encourage people to tell their stories, you know. If it's your uncle's story or your grandfather's story or your own story, there's no harm in telling it. And I think what Ken has managed to do, and what we've managed to do, is bring a story out there that can help everybody, the Donnellys and the Muldoons and, you know, the other families and other people involved, just to hear it, and then it's not so bad. It's the stuff that we don't hear and people won't tell that really, really hurts us, you know. So thanks very much to everybody for coming. I'm amazed at the interest in it, and this is the gentleman who has done all of the really important research over a very long period of time, and he really deserves a round of applause. Well done, Ken.
the final thing I'd like to say is, you know, we're basically here to commemorate the death of a great local doctor from Mohill. A tragedy to his family. His murder happened under the cloak of a conflict, but there's really nothing to do with it. The book, our book, is dedicated to all the victims of the Civil War. Pat mentioned various victims around this area, and from memory there were 12 deaths in Leitrim in the Civil War. 6 of them were civilians, you know, and just to kind of bear that in mind. And you know, as I say, it's great to have this get together, but it is the centenary of what was an absolute tragedy for Ritas Muldoon and her children.
I won't even try to emulate those two excellent conclusions. So thank you again to Ken Boyle and Tim Desmond and Padraig McGarty. And thank you all for coming. And I know we tried to cram us all in. Just final note, if most of you have it in your hand, but we produced this booklet which includes the photograph of Father Ryan's, thank you, and some photographs courtesy of the Muldoon family and Ken, thank you. It also includes some outstanding photographs of the cast and crew that I really would love you to put your hands together and give a round of applause to, because I think they did an outstanding job.